The wind cut across the dry Nevada plain like a blade, carrying the faint smell of sagebrush and dust. In the quiet of the cemetery, only the distant hum of a freight train broke the silence. Marjorie Hayes pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her breath fogging in the cool morning air. She knelt in front of a weathered gravestone, tracing the engraved letters with a trembling hand. Linda Hayes, 1953 to 1977. 4 to 6 years. The number seemed unreal. Her sister had vanished in a town that prided itself on knowing everyone, in a state where the desert stretched like an endless expanse, indifferent to the small tragedies it sheltered. And now, after nearly half a century, Marjorie was here, hoping for answers she wasn't sure she would ever get. She closed her eyes, letting memory carry her back to that fateful day. Linda's laugh, bright and unrestrained, had once filled every corner of their modest Reno home. The energy she carried, the dreams of escaping the small town to pursue acting and adventure, seemed almost impossible to reconcile with the emptiness the years had left behind. A sudden crunch of gravel made Marjorie look up. The cemetery was empty, she was alone, but the sound felt like a reminder that someone, somewhere, had been walking these same paths decades ago. Someone who might have known what had happened to her sister. Marjorie's mind raced with questions that had haunted her for decades. How could a young woman disappear without a trace in a town that felt so small? How could someone look at her sister and take her life, knowing the devastation it would leave behind? And who had finally sent the tip that reopened this nightmare after so many years? She knelt again, her fingers brushing the cold stone. "I'm still waiting for you, Linda," she whispered. "Still waiting for justice." The wind shifted, carrying with it a faint echo of a memory, the last time Linda had left the house, the smile she had worn, the spark of ambition in her eyes. No one knew exactly what had happened that night in 1977, and yet, somehow, the past had begun to speak again. An anonymous call had reignited the investigation, unraveling threads that had been dormant for decades. A raven cawed in the distance, and Marjorie shivered, feeling the weight of both time and silence. Somewhere out there, someone knew. And soon, the truth would reach her. As she rose to leave, her gaze lingered on the grave one last time. The desert sun was beginning to climb, casting long shadows across the cracked earth. It felt like a beginning, but she knew the road ahead would be fraught with old secrets, lies, and revelations that no one in Reno could have anticipated. Some questions had been buried for too long. Some answers were waiting in the shadows. And in the small town of Reno, Nevada, 4 to 6 years of silence were about to be broken. Linda Hayes was 24, a woman whose energy seemed larger than life. In the small town of Reno, she was known for her bright smile, quick wit, and an irrepressible curiosity about the world beyond the high desert. Friends described her as the kind of person who could light up a room the moment she walked in, while family remembered her as fiercely loyal, protective of her younger sister, Marjorie, and endlessly ambitious. Born in 1953, Linda grew up navigating the dusty streets and wide-open skies of northern Nevada, where the mountains rose like silent sentinels and the desert stretched in every direction. She loved hiking in the Sierra Nevadas, collecting wildflowers along forgotten trails, and photographing the desert landscapes that seemed to mirror her restless spirit. She had dreams bigger than Reno, her childhood friend, Carol Jennings, would later recount, her voice tinged with sorrow. She wanted to move to Los Angeles, to see the world, to be someone, not just someone known here, but someone remembered. Linda's life was not just about adventure, it was about connection. She worked part-time at a small diner on the outskirts of town, where she became a familiar face to locals. Regulars spoke of her warmth and generosity, recounting how she would always slip an extra cup of coffee to someone struggling, or listen patiently to a stranger's story. She volunteered on weekends at a local shelter, tutoring children and helping organize community events. She had friends everywhere, teachers, co-workers, neighbors, and yet there was a depth to her that suggested she was always chasing something just out of reach. Her family, especially Marjorie, saw her as both sister and confidant. They shared secrets, whispered dreams late into the night, and planned adventures for a future that now would never come. Linda's disappearance shattered that future. "It's hard to describe the emptiness," Marjorie would later say. "It's not just losing a sister. It's losing a part of yourself, a part of your world that you didn't realize held everything you loved." Linda's last days were unremarkable in outward appearance but were rich with ordinary moments that now, in retrospect, seem almost painfully poignant. She had a habit of stopping at the small corner store on her way home from work, chatting with the cashier about local gossip. She wrote letters to friends she had made on brief trips to Lake Tahoe and Las Vegas, sharing ambitions and small triumphs. In one letter, she joked about how Reno felt like a town that forgets its young people, and how she longed to escape, to chase something bigger. Even small incidents now take on weight in hindsight. There were reports of a stranger seen lingering near her apartment complex the week before her disappearance, a minor argument with a coworker that seemed trivial at the time, and a series of phone calls from an unknown number. None of these moments would have raised alarm individually, but together, they paint a subtle tension that hints at something dark lurking beneath the ordinary rhythm of her life. The community, too, felt the sting of her absence. Linda was someone people relied on, someone whose laughter and energy filled spaces otherwise defined by quiet and routine. When she vanished, whispers began to circulate, neighbors speculated, rumors festered, and fear crept into conversations that had once been casual. People wondered aloud, could something like this really happen here? The town, previously safe in its isolation, felt suddenly vulnerable. Family members were left in a limbo of hope and despair. Days, weeks, months passed without answers. Marjorie clung to routines, revisiting places Linda loved, talking to anyone who might have seen her sister. Their parents oscillated between determination and resignation, each day a struggle to hold on to hope while facing the harsh reality that time might never return their daughter. Friends, too, were left with questions that had no answers. Carol Jennings, reflecting years later, said, "We all wondered if we could have done something differently. If someone, anyone, had paid attention, maybe we could have stopped it." Linda's life, so vibrant and full of promise, was brutally interrupted. But in telling her story, her humanity shines through, the jokes she shared, the care she gave, the dreams she chased. These are the threads that make her disappearance more than a mystery. They make it a human tragedy that reverberates through everyone who knew her. Subtle hints about potential connections to her future suspect already existed in this ordinary life. Some colleagues remembered an individual who lingered too long in conversations, someone whose presence made Linda uneasy. Small disagreements, minor but persistent, had been noted by friends. Though no one could have imagined the tragedy that would follow, these moments foreshadow the complex web that investigators would eventually unravel decades later. In many ways, Linda Hayes represents what every unsolved case leaves behind: unanswered questions, fractured families, and a community struggling to reconcile the person they loved with the cold, cruel reality of loss. The stakes were not just personal, they were social, a reminder that in a tight-knit town, one disappearance ripples outward, affecting everyone, from neighbors to casual acquaintances, leaving a void that no time can fully fill. And so, as investigators decades later would follow the faint threads of evidence, they would have to navigate not only the physical clues but also the emotional weight that Linda's life and death carried, a weight felt by family, friends, and the town itself, a reminder that every cold case is more than a puzzle. It is the story of a life abruptly cut short, and the relentless human desire for truth and justice. The week leading up to Linda Hayes' disappearance seemed, on the surface, like any other in Reno. But in hindsight, the ordinary moments of her life now seem charged with small tensions and overlooked signs, threads that would later weave into the fabric of a dark mystery. Monday, June 13, 1977. Linda arrived early at her part-time job at the diner on the outskirts of Reno. She greeted co-workers warmly, but her friend and colleague, Carol Jennings, noticed a shadow in her eyes. She seemed distracted, Carol recalled later. Linda laughed it off when asked, attributing it to stress from her upcoming acting auditions in Los Angeles. That evening, she stopped by the corner store to pick up groceries. The clerk remembered a man standing too close in line, his gaze lingering longer than appropriate. Linda had smiled politely, keeping her voice light, but the unease was evident. "I didn't think much of it at the time," the clerk would later say, "but looking back, it was strange." Tuesday, June 14th. Linda spent the morning at the local library, researching acting workshops in California. She borrowed a notebook, jotting ideas for scenes and monologues she intended to practice. Later, she visited the post office to mail letters to friends she had made on a previous Lake Tahoe trip. One of those letters, addressed to a friend in Los Angeles, included a light-hearted note: "Someday I'll leave this town behind, I promise. But I'll never forget Reno." By evening, she had dinner with Marjorie at their family home. The two sisters shared stories, laughter, and plans for a short hiking trip in the Sierra Nevadas the following weekend. It was ordinary, comforting, and yet, unknowingly, the last time they would share such a carefree evening. Wednesday, June 15th. Linda's co-workers noticed subtle tension during her shift at the diner. A new customer, a man with no clear purpose in the area, kept staring at her from across the room. She smiled and continued working, but the unease was palpable. A fellow waitress later recalled, she was polite, but she didn't feel comfortable. It was like she sensed someone was watching her. After work, Linda stopped by her apartment to sort through mail. There was an unfamiliar letter, postmarked from Las Vegas, but she set it aside without reading it. She later made a brief phone call to a friend in the city, sounding upbeat but slightly distracted. The content of the call would remain unknown, a small mystery in the timeline that investigators would later scrutinize. Thursday, June 16th. Linda spent the morning preparing for her audition in Los Angeles. She carefully practiced lines in front of a mirror, adjusting her gestures, perfecting intonation. Later, she met a neighbor in the apartment complex hallway. The neighbor, recalling the encounter years later, said, Linda seemed anxious, like she wanted to leave quickly. She was friendly, but tense. That evening, Linda ran errands, picking up groceries, mailing another letter, and returning a borrowed library book. On her way home, she passed a man leaning against a lamppost, someone she had seen around the neighborhood in the past week. He nodded casually, and she nodded back, unaware that he had begun observing her movements with interest. Friday, June 17th. Linda met her friend Carol at a local cafe to discuss weekend hiking plans. She spoke about excitement for the trip but also mentioned feeling like someone was following her on previous errands. Carol laughed it off, thinking it was paranoia, yet Linda's voice held a subtle edge of worry. I don't want to sound silly, she said, stirring her coffee, but I can't shake this feeling. After the cafe, Linda returned to her apartment to pack for the weekend. A neighbor reported seeing a stranger lurking near the building, taking unusual interest in her movements. By nightfall, Linda had spoken with Marjorie, confirming plans for the hike and promising to call early Saturday morning. That call never came. Saturday, June 18th, the day she disappeared. Linda began the morning with a brisk walk, as she often did, carrying a small backpack and humming softly. She waved at a familiar neighbor, smiled at a passing jogger, and stopped briefly at the corner store. The clerk would later recall, she seemed normal, happy even. But there was a tension I didn't understand. She kept glancing over her shoulder. She was last seen leaving the store around 10:45 a.m., heading toward the Sierra Nevada foothills. Surveillance was minimal in 1977, so there was no definitive visual record of her movements after that. Her family expected her to call by late afternoon to confirm hiking plans, but the call never came. By evening, her absence had begun to stir concern. Marjorie called friends, co-workers, and even the diner, trying to track her whereabouts. No one had seen her since that morning. Panic quietly settled into the family home, a slow, suffocating dread that would only intensify over the coming hours. The summer sun hung low over Reno on that fateful afternoon, casting long shadows across the dry, cracked streets. By early evening, a sense of unease had settled over the Hayes household. Calls to friends, co-workers, and even the diner where Linda worked yielded nothing. Each unanswered attempt deepened the gnawing dread that had taken root in her family's hearts. Marjorie paced the living room, phone pressed to her ear, willing someone, anyone, to provide a clue. Her mother, hands trembling, stared out the window, unable to comprehend how a life so bright could vanish in the ordinary rhythm of a Nevada day. By dusk, Marjorie decided she could wait no longer. She would begin searching herself. Discovery in the desert foothills. By 7:30 p.m., Marjorie had driven to the area where Linda had intended to hike, trails along the Sierra Nevada foothills, dry and rugged, dust swirling at every footstep. The sun was sinking, the light turning golden and fragile, shadows stretching like fingers over the terrain. She called Linda's name, voice cracking, reverberating across the rocky expanse. No response. As she rounded a bend, Marjorie noticed something unusual, a small patch of disturbed dirt near a cluster of scrub pines. At first, she thought it was an animal, but the shape beneath the branches froze her blood. She ran closer, heart pounding, and realized the unthinkable. Her sister's body lay there, partially obscured by the scrub. Marjorie screamed, a raw, piercing sound that seemed to shatter the desert stillness. She stumbled back, then fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. Her voice was frantic, almost incoherent. It's Linda, she's here, oh God, please help. Initial reactions and confusion. The first responders arrived within 30 minutes, a small Nevada police contingent guided by the flickering beams of flashlights and the harsh glare of headlights. Officer Tom Reynolds, one of the first to reach the scene, would later describe the moment with a trembling voice. I'd seen accidents, domestic disputes, but nothing prepared me for seeing a young woman lying there, and knowing the life had already been stolen from her. The crime scene was immediately cordoned off, but even in the early moments, contradictions emerged. Linda's body was positioned unnaturally, lying partially face down, with her arms stiff at odd angles. Nearby, her backpack, normally a constant companion, was missing, as were her personal items, purse, notebook, and letters she had been carrying. Only her jacket remained, tossed casually a few feet away. The disparity between the natural, open environment and the deliberate arrangement of items suggested to investigators that something beyond a simple accident or misadventure had occurred. The scene was simultaneously ordinary and unsettling, each detail a small mystery demanding explanation. The witnesses. Although Marjorie had been the first to find Linda, other witnesses emerged in the following days. Hikers in the area reported seeing a figure moving near the same trail earlier that afternoon, someone unfamiliar to them, who appeared to be following the path Linda had taken. Another local claimed to have seen a car parked unusually near the trailhead, its driver watching the woods for an extended period. Neighbors remembered noticing a strange van circling the area in the days prior, a vehicle that didn't belong to anyone living nearby. While these accounts were dismissed at first as coincidence, they would later become crucial pieces of the puzzle, hinting at premeditation and surveillance. Police assessment. Detectives arrived soon after, methodically taking in the scene. Sergeant Alan Whitmore, veteran of the Reno Police Department, noted the oddities. Contradictory evidence. The position of the body suggested Linda had not succumbed to an accident. Scratches on her arms and legs indicated a struggle. Missing items. Personal belongings were absent, implying theft or a deliberate attempt to remove identifying clues. Signs of observation. Nearby brush showed faint, broken twigs, suggesting someone had moved stealthily before the discovery. Forensic limitations in 1977 constrained their investigation. DNA analysis was decades away, and fingerprint technology was basic at best. Investigators relied on meticulous observation, sketches, photographs, and witness interviews. Every detail mattered, yet many remained frustratingly ambiguous. Family reactions and emotional impact. Marjorie, now surrounded by police and detectives, could barely speak. Her mother collapsed onto the ground, weeping openly, as officers tried to console her. The stark reality hit hard. Linda Hayes, vibrant, full of life, taken in a manner that defied understanding, was gone. The family's grief was immediate and overwhelming. Friends who had gathered were paralyzed, whispering fragments of memory, trying to make sense of the inexplicable. Carol Jennings, arriving later, stared silently at the scene, unable to reconcile the Linda she knew with the lifeless form before her. "I kept thinking it would be a mistake, that someone had misread a situation, but it wasn't," she later said. She was really gone. The emotional toll on the family and community was profound. In a town like Reno, where neighbors were familiar with one another and strangers were rare, the disappearance, and now the violent death, of Linda Hayes became a shock that resonated far beyond her immediate circle. Autopsy and unknown details. As the body was transported for autopsy, the investigative team faced their first truly confounding discovery. Preliminary reports hinted at injuries inconsistent with a simple fall or accidental trauma. There were bruises, subtle but deliberate, suggesting the involvement of another person. More disturbing were small marks on her wrists and neck, evidence of restraint or struggle. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The case was no longer a disappearance, it was a homicide. And yet, the limited forensic tools of the era left investigators with more questions than answers. Who had been near her that day? Was the attacker someone local, or a stranger? How had they managed to go undetected in a town where everyone knew one another? The evening closed with a sense of foreboding. The sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the desert in muted blues and purples. Shadows stretched across the landscape, echoing the uncertainty that would dominate the investigation. And in the minds of Linda's family and the police, a single, chilling question remained. Who could have done this, and why? The night Linda Hayes' body was discovered, Reno police faced a grim reality. They were dealing with a homicide in a town that had rarely seen violent crime. Sergeant Alan Whitmore and Detective Frank Moreno, both seasoned officers, arrived at the crime scene shortly after dark, flashlights cutting through the desert shadows. The evidence was stark and puzzling, her body positioned unnaturally, belongings missing, signs of struggle, but concrete leads were nearly non-existent. The first order of business was to secure every detail. Officers cordoned off the area, marking footprints in the dust, photographing the body, and sketching the surrounding terrain. Even under the harsh scrutiny of police tape and flashlights, subtle inconsistencies stood out. Footprints leading to and away from the scene suggested multiple people had been present. Some were Linda's, others not identifiable. Broken twigs and disturbed underbrush indicated movement through the terrain that was not immediately obvious to the eye. A discarded scarf and jacket hinted at either a struggle or an attempt to conceal something. Police interviews. In the days following the discovery, detectives interviewed nearly everyone connected to Linda, starting with family, friends, co-workers, and neighbors. Each conversation revealed fragments of a life now shadowed by violence. Family members. Marjorie Hayes recounted the last time she saw her sister, describing Linda's nervous glances during errands in the week leading up to her disappearance. Her parents, still in shock, mentioned seeing strangers in the area near the apartment complex days prior, but none of the sightings had been reported at the time. Their grief was palpable, and for investigators, every tear-stained account became a reminder that the clock was ticking, and evidence could fade quickly. Co-workers. At the diner, colleagues remembered Linda's behavior in the days before her disappearance. Several noted her unease, attributing it to stress over auditions. A few recalled a man lingering near her table on separate occasions, someone who appeared out of place and unnervingly attentive. While some dismissed these encounters as coincidence, investigators catalogued them meticulously. Neighbors. Residents near the apartment complex described seeing unfamiliar cars parked near the building, some idling for hours. One neighbor remembered a man watching the complex from across the street, holding what appeared to be binoculars. These observations, though fragmented, hinted at someone surveilling Linda in the days leading up to her death. Forensic limitations. Forensics in 1977 were rudimentary compared to modern standards. Fingerprinting was standard, but DNA evidence was decades away. Investigators relied on physical observations, photographs, and the limited technology of the time. Autopsy findings. Preliminary examination revealed bruising inconsistent with a fall. Subtle marks suggested restraint, and minor abrasions on her arms and legs indicated a struggle. Cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation, but the exact sequence of events remained unclear. Evidence collection. Police catalogued every item near the scene, noting the absence of Linda's backpack and letters, which raised questions about motive. Small traces of foreign material, fibers, dust, and an unidentified hair, were preserved, though forensic analysis was slow and often inconclusive. Rumors and community paranoia. As news of Linda's death spread, Reno's tight-knit community began to whisper. Each conversation carried speculation and fear, fueling tension that would complicate the investigation. Some suggested a robbery gone wrong, pointing to her missing belongings. Others suspected someone from outside the community, a stranger drawn by opportunity. A handful feared a personal vendetta, noting minor disagreements Linda had in the week leading up to her death. Detectives had to navigate a delicate balance, listening to these accounts without allowing rumor to contaminate the investigation. The line between helpful information and misleading speculation was razor-thin, and the pressure to find a suspect mounted daily. Early suspects and leads. Within the first week, investigators explored several potential leads, each yielding frustrating dead ends. The stranger at the diner. Witnesses described a man who had lingered near Linda in the days before her disappearance. Officers canvassed the area, interviewed patrons, and checked local records for anyone matching the description, but the lead quickly went cold. The man could not be identified. Neighbors' reports. Cars idling near the apartment complex were traced, but none were linked to known offenders or criminal activity. Surveillance of the area was minimal in 1977, leaving investigators without video evidence or definitive confirmation of the sightings. Personal connections. Police questioned past acquaintances, including co-workers and casual friends. While some had minor conflicts with Linda, nothing suggested the level of violence required for murder. These interviews, though thorough, produced no concrete suspect. Random act versus targeted attack. Investigators debated whether Linda's death was opportunistic or premeditated. The missing personal items suggested theft, but the signs of struggle, restraint, and surveillance hinted at something more sinister. Eyewitness contradictions. A challenge early in the investigation was conflicting witness accounts. One neighbor insisted she had seen a man following Linda on the trail that Saturday morning, while another claimed the area was empty. A third witness reported a suspicious vehicle near the trailhead, but the make and color varied between statements. Detectives knew these discrepancies were common in chaotic situations, but each contradiction slowed the case. They needed corroboration, something tangible to anchor the investigation. But in 1977, resources were limited, and memories were unreliable. Investigative strategy. Detectives Whitmore and Moreno devised a strategy. Reconstruct Linda's last day. They retraced her errands, visiting the diner, corner store, and trailhead to gather impressions and physical clues. Catalog potential suspects. Every person with proximity to Linda in the preceding week was noted and questioned. Preserve evidence meticulously. Even minor items, fibers, footprints, and broken twigs, were documented, photographed, and stored. Despite these efforts, the investigation faced immediate challenges. The combination of limited technology, fading memories, and the passage of time between sightings made it increasingly difficult to distinguish fact from speculation. Emotional tension in the community. Linda's disappearance and the discovery of her body left a community in shock. Friends and family carried fear and anger, often blaming themselves or imagining scenarios that could have prevented her death. Local media sensationalized the case, further complicating the investigation. Detectives faced pressure to act quickly, yet they knew that rash conclusions could ruin the integrity of the case. Marjorie Hayes, meanwhile, became a constant presence at the police station, providing leads, answering questions, and pleading for progress. Her persistence became both a source of hope and frustration. Hope that someone would find the answers, frustration at the slow, painstaking pace of investigative work. The stage set for years of silence. By the end of the initial investigation phase, Reno police had compiled mountains of notes, sketches, and witness statements, yet the suspect remained elusive. Linda's case had become a tangle of possibilities, a robbery gone wrong, a personal vendetta, or the act of a stranger. Each lead hinted at a resolution but slipped away under scrutiny, leaving investigators with a growing sense of frustration. The first weeks concluded with no arrests, no definitive suspects, and a community left with unanswered questions. The case, once full of immediacy and hope, began to show the early signs of the long silence that would define its history. As the weeks turned into months following Linda Hayes' death, the initial shock that gripped Reno slowly transformed into a heavy, suffocating frustration. The early flurry of investigation, the questioning of neighbors, co-workers, and distant acquaintances, the collection of footprints, fibers, and broken twigs, had yielded no definitive suspect. Each potential lead vanished like smoke in the dry Nevada air, leaving family and investigators grasping at shadows. For the Hayes family, the absence of answers was a daily torment. Marjorie, Linda's younger sister, took it upon herself to revisit the trailhead, the corner store, and the diner multiple times a week, searching for something that might have been overlooked. Each time, she returned empty-handed, carrying the weight of hope and despair in equal measure. "I kept thinking, maybe today I'll see something," she later recalled. "Maybe someone will remember a detail I missed," but nothing ever came. Early investigative dead ends. The police, constrained by the forensic technology of 1977, were meticulous but limited in their approach. The initial leads, including the man seen lingering at the diner, the mysterious van near the apartment, and conflicting eyewitness reports, ultimately went cold. Suspect number 1, the diner stranger. Officers canvassed the surrounding area for any information on the man who had appeared near Linda in the days prior. Despite extensive interviews with local residents and patrons, the stranger could not be identified. The lead, once promising, fizzled into nothing. Suspect number 2, neighbors and personal acquaintances. Police followed up on reported tensions and minor disputes in Linda's life. Though investigators interviewed dozens of acquaintances, nothing suggested a clear motive or opportunity for murder. Each interview ended with a frustrating dead end. Suspect number 3, random act theory. Some officers explored the possibility that Linda had been the victim of an opportunistic attack, a robbery or random assault. Yet the missing items and evidence of surveillance indicated planning, contradicting this theory. Despite these early efforts, the case began to show the signs that would define it for decades. No arrests, no confessions, and no actionable evidence. Impact on the family. The toll on Linda's family was immediate and long-lasting. In the months following her death, emotional strain, her parents drifted into a quiet, persistent grief. The father, once active in the community, withdrew entirely, retreating to the solitude of the family home. Her mother spent hours staring at her daughter's empty room, clutching Linda's personal belongings as if their presence could somehow fill the void. Marjorie's grief manifested as relentless determination. She kept scrapbooks of media clippings, photographs, and witness statements, creating her own timeline of events. Nights were often sleepless, haunted by the image of her sister lying alone in the desert. Fractured relationships. Extended family struggled under the weight of loss and uncertainty. Marriages strained, friendships cooled, and relatives relocated to escape the shadow of the tragedy. The emotional ripple of Linda's disappearance and death was broader than anyone had anticipated. Even neighbors, once casual acquaintances, found themselves unable to ignore the emptiness left by her absence. Local gatherings, once lively, carried an undertone of unease, as if everyone were waiting for a resolution that never came. Community frustration and speculation. Reno, a small city where people often recognized the faces of strangers, was deeply affected. The lack of progress left space for speculation and rumor, which grew in the vacuum of information. Some suggested a stranger from outside the community, possibly from Las Vegas or California, had targeted Linda. Others speculated that someone within the neighborhood had motives no one could understand. Children dared each other to approach the trailhead at night, turning Linda's death into a cautionary tale laced with fear. The persistent gossip created tension in the town, making it difficult for law enforcement to separate fact from fiction. Detectives had to navigate a delicate balance, respecting community concerns while focusing on tangible evidence. Attempts at closure and public awareness. The Hayes family did not remain passive. They reached out to local media, hoping that renewed public attention might yield leads. Newspaper articles ran weekly updates, some highlighting witness recollections, others emphasizing the lack of progress. Letters poured into the police department from individuals claiming knowledge of the crime, some helpful, others entirely fabricated. Public pressure was relentless. While investigators appreciated the support, it also created challenges. False leads consumed time, and each rumor risked tainting the few reliable accounts available. Nevertheless, the family persisted, driven by the belief that someone, somewhere, held a key piece of information. Psychological toll on investigators. Even for the police, the case became a source of long-term strain. Detectives Whitmore and Moreno, assigned to Linda's investigation from the beginning, found themselves revisiting the same questions repeatedly, running the same witness interviews, and retracing the same paths. The limitations of 1977 forensic science, no DNA testing, rudimentary fingerprint analysis, and minimal crime scene documentation, compounded their frustration. Years later, both would recall the emotional weight of the case. Whitmore noted, "You can follow leads, you can canvass neighborhoods, you can talk to dozens of people. But when you hit a wall, when the evidence runs cold, it stays with you. It becomes a part of you." Linda's case haunted me for decades. The case gradually grows cold. By the early 1980s, the initial momentum had waned. Investigators had exhausted most immediate leads, and public attention shifted to other news. Yet the Hayes family refused to let go. Marjorie continued to visit the trailhead, sometimes finding herself alone with only the wind and the ghost of memories. Family and friends held annual memorials, quietly reminding the community that Linda's absence had not been forgotten. Police files grew, stacked in cabinets, untouched for long stretches but preserved for a day when new methods or new witnesses might finally shed light. Despite decades of frustration, the family clung to the hope that someone would remember a detail that could reignite the investigation. A passing comment, a forgotten observation, a letter tucked away in a drawer. Dramatic irony and foreshadowing. Even as time passed, subtle hints about the true perpetrator existed, though they remained invisible to investigators and community members. Minor inconsistencies in neighbor reports that seemed inconsequential. A lingering figure seen near the apartment in 1977, whose identity would later prove crucial. Misfiled documents and overlooked correspondence, trivial at the time, which decades later would provide critical clues. For readers, these fragments create dramatic irony. They can sense the connections that the investigators cannot, heightening tension and anticipation for the eventual breakthrough. The long shadow of loss. The psychological and emotional toll on the Hayes family, and the Reno community, cannot be overstated. Every unsolved detail became a source of daily anguish. Friends and relatives carried guilt and what-if scenarios for years. Social networks changed, some friends drifting away, others unable to cope with the omnipresent grief. The case became a permanent fixture in the lives of those connected to Linda Hayes, a reminder that unresolved violence leaves scars not only on its immediate victims but on everyone who loved them. Closing reflection. The dead ends of the 1970s and 1980s would set the stage for the eventual breakthrough decades later. While investigators faced limitations of technology, witness reliability, and community rumor, the persistence of the Hayes family and subtle threads of evidence remained intact. The story of Linda Hayes was not simply a cold case, it was a living memory, a wound carried by a community, a puzzle whose pieces were scattered but not lost. As years passed, detectives, journalists, and family alike would cling to hope that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, could still emerge. This period of silence and frustration laid the emotional groundwork for Phase 4, breakthrough, where a single event, perhaps an overlooked clue or a new technology, would finally begin to unravel the decades-long mystery. As the years passed, Linda Hayes' death became more than a tragedy. It transformed into a story that whispered through the streets of Reno, twisting fact into rumor, rumor into legend. What began as a real, human loss evolved into the lore of the community, carried in hushed conversations, daring dares, and the uneasy memory of the Sierra Nevada foothills where her life had ended so abruptly. Even before official investigations slowed, children and teenagers began to approach the trails differently. The site where Linda had been found, a cluster of scrub pines, rocks, and scrubby desert floor, became the setting for whispered tales of danger. Parents cautioned their children against venturing too far, and older kids told stories that made their younger siblings shiver. The trailhead as a site of fear. By 1978, a year after the discovery, the trailhead near Linda's apartment had taken on a reputation. Hikers passed it with uneasy glances, sensing an intangible tension that hovered like heat over the dry Nevada landscape. Local dares, adolescents challenged one another to approach the trailhead at dusk, a test of courage and bravado. If you can touch the tree where they found her backpack, one teen would say, you're brave enough for anything. Often, no one actually dared to go near the spot, and the fear became a badge of honor. Mysterious figures. Some reported seeing strangers along the path, fleeting shadows, or figures watching silently from a distance. In most cases, these sightings were likely harmless hikers or travelers. Yet, when attached to the legend of Linda's murder, they became sinister omens, a reminder that the killer might still be out there. For many in Reno, the trailhead was no longer just a hiking route, it was a site of psychological tension, where the memory of violence had infused the environment with a lingering unease. Whispered theories and conspiracy. The combination of unanswered questions and limited investigative closure gave rise to an array of theories. The stranger in the van. Older residents recalled seeing a mysterious van parked near the apartment complex in 1977, a detail that became the centerpiece of countless rumors. Some speculated that the driver had returned to the area repeatedly, scouting potential victims or evading the law. Local suspect theories. Even without evidence, some insisted the perpetrator must have been someone known to Linda, a neighbor or co-worker with motives hidden behind polite facades. These stories circulated in coffee shops and diners, often with more certainty than facts could justify. Supernatural embellishments. Over time, ghostly sightings were added. Some claimed to see Linda's figure walking the trails at dusk, a pale, ephemeral shape framed by the desert light. Others reported feeling sudden chills or unease near the site, interpreting it as her restless spirit. These embellishments were typical of small-town legend-making, yet they kept Linda Hayes' memory alive in a way that both haunted and fascinated the community. The media's role. Local newspapers and radio stations occasionally revisited the case, often blending fact with speculation. Headlines like Ghost in the Desert, Teens report strange sightings near trailhead or mysterious van linked to cold case, blurred the line between reporting and rumor. The media coverage had a dual effect. Keeping attention alive, every article reminded residents of Linda's disappearance, preventing the story from being forgotten entirely. Distorting perception. Some details were exaggerated or misreported, leading the public to believe in false patterns or connections. For instance, a misremembered license plate number became the basis for years of speculation, leading to dead-end tips that consumed police time and resources. While frustrating for investigators, this attention maintained a collective memory of the case, a memory that would eventually intersect with modern investigative breakthroughs. Psychological impact on the community. The ongoing legends had tangible effects on Reno's social fabric. Heightened suspicion. Residents became wary of strangers and overly attentive to unusual behavior. Small acts, a lingering glance, a car parked too long, were often interpreted as sinister. Collective trauma. Even those with no direct connection to Linda experienced a subtle, persistent anxiety. Her death became a marker of vulnerability in a town that once prided itself on safety and familiarity. Cultural transmission. Stories of Linda's murder were passed from one generation to the next. Children who had not even been born in 1977 grew up hearing the tale, internalizing the fear and mystery surrounding the case. In this sense, Linda Hayes' murder had a social afterlife, shaping perceptions and behaviors long after the initial investigation stalled. Minor clues hidden in folklore. While most of the legends were unsubstantiated, a few retained kernels of truth that would later prove important. The van. Reports of a vehicle parked near the apartment complex were accurate, though details were muddled in retelling. Investigators would eventually use this memory to track down potential suspects. Shadowy figures. Occasional sightings of someone near the trailhead aligned with early police interviews describing a man who had been seen following Linda. These recollections, distorted over time, nevertheless contained critical insights. Discarded items. Children daring each other to touch rocks or trees sometimes noticed fragments of objects, scraps of paper or fabric, that investigators had overlooked. Though trivial at the time, these minor artifacts contributed to the larger puzzle decades later. The folklore, in its own way, preserved fragments of the crime that could have been lost entirely if not for human memory and communal storytelling. The haunting persistence of memory. Linda Hayes' story became a quiet obsession for some residents. Teachers used it as a cautionary tale, hikers whispered it on the trails, and families recalled it during dinner conversations. While painful, this collective remembrance ensured that the case was never entirely forgotten. The myths and legends surrounding the murder did something the police could not. They kept Linda's presence alive in the community's imagination. In a town where evidence had run cold, memory became the repository of truth, hope, and fear. Foreshadowing the breakthrough. As the 1980s unfolded, a sense of inevitability began to form. The details preserved in rumor and legend, the van, the shadowy figure, the trailhead, hinted at truths buried beneath decades of misremembered accounts. Investigators, when revisiting the case years later, would find that minor details in these urban myths aligned with overlooked evidence. Family members, recalling seemingly trivial observations, would provide key testimony in the eventual reopening of the investigation. Memory, collective folklore, and anecdotal stories, once considered distractions, would become instrumental in reconstructing the crime. Thus, while the community struggled under the weight of fear, speculation, and grief, they unknowingly preserved the breadcrumbs that would lead to justice. The legends and myths were not mere stories, they were fragments of truth, waiting for someone to connect the dots. By the time Linda Hayes' case officially went cold in the late 1980s, it had left a profound mark on Reno. Psychological, a persistent sense of danger, mistrust of strangers, and the shadow of grief. Cultural, a story passed through generations, blending memory and myth into an enduring narrative. Investigative, hidden clues embedded in rumor and recollection, later to be critical in reopening the case. The legend surrounding Linda Hayes served as a bridge between the immediate aftermath of the crime and the eventual breakthrough decades later. In a town that had seen her life stolen, the memory, and the mystery, remained alive, waiting for the moment when persistence, new methods, and fresh eyes would finally pierce the veil of silence. Decades had passed since Linda Hayes' body was discovered along the scrubby Nevada trailhead. Reno had moved on, life continuing in the shadow of that unsolved murder. But the memory of Linda lingered, not just in her family's grief or in whispered tales along the trail, but in a meticulously preserved collection of evidence that sat quietly in police archives. It was an ordinary Thursday morning in March 2023 when the catalyst arrived. Detective Maria Alvarez, a cold case specialist with the Nevada State Police, had been reviewing decades-old files for a separate investigation when she stumbled across Linda Hayes' case. The dusty folders were stacked high, each filled with photographs, witness statements, and sketches from 1977. As she paged through the files, one piece of evidence caught her eye, a seemingly mundane strand of hair preserved in a small envelope, labeled Unidentified, Trailhead Site, March 12, 1977. Modern forensics meet cold case evidence. Detective Alvarez immediately saw potential in an arena unavailable to 1977 investigators: DNA analysis. Advances in forensic science had transformed the field, enabling specialists to extract genetic profiles from evidence once considered unusable. Alvarez contacted the state forensic lab, requesting that the preserved hair be tested for any viable DNA. It was a painstaking process. The sample was small, degraded, and decades old, but the lab technicians worked with precision, understanding the significance of their task. 2 weeks later, the results arrived, a complete DNA profile, previously unattainable, with no matches in the criminal database, but with enough detail to create a familial search. An unexpected tip. While the DNA analysis was underway, another development occurred. The Reno Police Department received an anonymous tip via email. The sender, careful to obscure their identity, claimed knowledge of the murder and hinted at evidence overlooked in the original investigation. Check the correspondence files of the diner. The notes were saved but ignored. They know who she was seeing. They think it's buried. It's not. Find it before it's too late. Detective Alvarez immediately recognized the significance. Even after decades, someone with intimate knowledge of the case was reaching out, suggesting there was more information hidden in plain sight. She tasked her team with locating the diner's archived records, long thought lost in municipal storage. Unearthed evidence from the diner. The diner, where Linda had spent much of her last week, had been a hub of community chatter. Employees, in the months before the murder, had noted a stranger who lingered, a man who appeared to observe Linda on multiple occasions. The diner's original notebooks, handwritten order logs and tip records, had been boxed and sent to city archives when the establishment closed in the early 1980s. Detective Alvarez's team meticulously sifted through hundreds of pages of faded ink and yellowing paper. And then, tucked between the margins of one notebook, a series of notes stood out. Repeated observations of a man sitting at the counter, asking about Linda's schedule. Mentions of small but suspicious interactions, the man leaving before Linda's shift ended, making phone calls in the parking lot, occasionally lingering in shadows. A partial license plate scrawled on the edge of a page, NV4, the rest faded but sufficient to cross-reference vehicle registration records. This discovery validated the anonymous tip and revealed a critical new lead. Renewed investigative strategy. With DNA and diner notes pointing in new directions, Alvarez assembled a task force. Their strategy combined modern technology with traditional detective work. Cross-referencing DNA, the hair sample was uploaded to national genealogy databases, searching for familial matches that might lead to a suspect. Tracing the partial license plate, city records and historical DMV files were analyzed to identify vehicles registered in 1977 matching the NV4 pattern. Re-interviewing witnesses, surviving neighbors, co-workers, and friends were contacted, some recalling details forgotten or previously dismissed. Even decades-old recollections became vital when corroborated with physical evidence. Alvarez knew that patience and precision would be essential. Each new lead required careful verification. The decades-long silence had taught investigators that old cases could collapse under assumptions. Breakthrough DNA match. Weeks into the renewed investigation, the first major breakthrough arrived. The DNA profile, combined with genealogical methods, identified a distant relative in the database. This connection led detectives to a small network of family members who had been living in northern Nevada at the time of the murder. Through careful interviews, the team narrowed the circle further, eventually identifying a man with ties to the Reno area in 1977, whose presence had been suspiciously close to Linda's known routines. His movements aligned with diner reports, neighborhood sightings, and accounts from friends noting an unfamiliar man observing Linda in the week before her death. Though circumstantial at this stage, Alvarez understood that these combined factors, genetic evidence, historical observation, and archival material, were far stronger than any lead investigators had in 1977. The catalyst had transformed a cold, decades-old file into an actionable investigation. Reconstructing the suspect's past. Detective Alvarez and her team began reconstructing the suspect's movements in 1977. Using property records, employment histories, and archived public documents, they mapped the suspect's likely locations relative to Linda's known routines. Employment. A seasonal job at a construction site near Linda's apartment complex suggested access to the neighborhood and knowledge of local patterns. Social connections. Interviews with old acquaintances revealed tensions and grudges, some minor but potentially significant. Vehicle tracking. The partial license plate from the diner notebook, combined with DMV and archived city records, provided a crucial lead. These historical reconstructions, paired with modern DNA analysis, gave Alvarez confidence that the decades-long silence was finally ending. The emotional impact on the Hayes family. The news of the catalyst event reverberated immediately. Marjorie Hayes, now in her late 60s, received a call from the Nevada State Police. "We have a lead, something we couldn't access before. The case isn't closed. We're following it now." For the first time in over 40 years, the Hayes family felt a spark of hope. The pain of decades of uncertainty, grief, guilt, and frustration, was tempered by the possibility of justice. Memories of Linda, once suspended in unresolved tragedy, began to feel like the beginning of resolution rather than an endless echo of loss. Tension and anticipation. With the catalyst event, Reno became a city cautiously aware of the pending breakthrough. Media outlets, already fascinated by cold cases solved through modern forensics, began reporting on the renewed investigation. Residents who had long told stories of the trailhead now felt the weight of potential closure, or confrontation with long-buried truths. Detective Alvarez and her team, acutely aware of the delicate nature of reopening the case, worked methodically. Maintaining secrecy. To avoid compromising the investigation, the team limited media releases. Confirming evidence, every new lead was double-checked, corroborated, and documented before action. Preparing for arrest, should the suspect be located, law enforcement planned for a precise, controlled operation to prevent escalation and ensure the chain of evidence remained intact. The combination of modern forensic science, archival discoveries, and persistent investigative work had created the perfect storm for a breakthrough. Closing the catalyst phase. The catalyst event, the convergence of DNA testing, the Dinah notebook, and the anonymous tip, set in motion the chain of events that would lead to the suspect's identification and eventual arrest. What had once been a case stalled for decades now moved forward with precision and momentum. The Hayes family, a community shaped by rumor and fear, and the investigators who had never given up were finally on the path to answers. The stage was set for reopened investigation, where the pieces of a 4 to 6-year-old puzzle would finally begin to click into place, bringing both hope and the tension of impending confrontation with the long-elusive perpetrator. The catalyst had set the wheels in motion. With DNA evidence confirming a familial link and the Dinah notebook revealing previously overlooked details, Detective Maria Alvarez and her cold case task force approached the reopened investigation with a combination of urgency and precision. After 4 to 6 years, the stakes were high, not only for justice for Linda Hayes but for a community long haunted by unresolved grief. Reconstructing the crime with modern tools. The first step was to digitally reconstruct the events surrounding Linda's last week. Using police reports, witness statements, and archival photographs, Alvarez created a timeline of her movements from March 1 to 12, 1977. Employment records, cross-referencing Linda's work at the diner and other temporary jobs, the team verified shifts and interactions with co-workers, noting times when she might have been alone or vulnerable. Neighborhood canvassing, Alvarez and her team revisited the apartment complex and surrounding streets. Many buildings had been remodeled, but the general geography of Linda's routines remained consistent. By walking the paths she once took, detectives visualized potential escape routes, observation points, and areas where a perpetrator might have lingered unnoticed. Technology meets history. Modern GIS mapping tools allowed the team to overlay historical photographs with current satellite imagery, giving investigators a sense of Linda's environment and the locations of key sightings from 1977. This digital reconstruction brought clarity to details previously scattered across decades of paper files. It revealed patterns in movements, encounters, and potential risks that had been invisible to investigators in the 1970s. Witness re-interviews, decades later. One of the most critical elements of the reopened investigation was revisiting the witnesses who had spoken to police in 1977. The passage of time had altered memories, but Alvarez knew that even fragmented recollections could provide valuable context when combined with other evidence. Diner employees, several former co-workers were located, some living out of state. Re-examining their statements revealed small details they had not considered important in 1977, such as a man who always seemed to ask about Linda's schedule but whose presence had been dismissed at the time. Neighbors, older residents recalled seeing a vehicle repeatedly parked near the apartment complex. While previously disregarded as coincidence, the details aligned with the partial license plate found in the Dinah notebook. Friends of Linda, Marjorie Hayes and a few close friends provided insights into Linda's personal life, including acquaintances who had been briefly suspected and cleared. Re-interviewing them helped the team separate genuine memories from decades of rumor and speculation. The interviews were delicate work. Some witnesses were reluctant, uncomfortable with revisiting trauma from decades ago. Others had lost family members or moved away. Alvarez approached each conversation with care, emphasizing the potential for finally bringing closure. Analyzing the overlooked evidence. With the combination of historical files and new interviews, the task force began examining evidence that had been overlooked or improperly analyzed in 1977. Dinah notebook observations. The man noted frequently in the Dinah logs was cross-referenced with DMV records, revealing a potential match to a resident near Reno at the time of Linda's disappearance. Photographs and crime scene material. Re-examining the original photos of the trailhead where Linda's body was found revealed faint tire tracks and scuff marks previously thought insignificant. Modern analysis suggested they were consistent with the vehicle associated with the Dinah sightings. Letters and correspondence. Files preserved from local businesses and personal letters contained subtle references to Linda's interactions with this man. At the time, investigators had dismissed them as trivial, but in context with DNA and location data, they became significant. By combining these previously unconnected pieces of information, Alvarez's team began constructing a comprehensive profile of the suspect, one that matched the pattern of sightings, behaviors, and proximity to Linda in March 1977. Building the suspect profile. The reopened investigation allowed the team to create a behavioral and historical profile of the suspect. Familiarity with Linda. Evidence suggested he knew her routines, frequented the same spaces, and had observed her over several days. Opportunity and access. His work and residence placed him near Linda at critical moments, matching times and locations reported in old witness statements. Psychological assessment. The pattern of stalking and interest indicated a controlled, patient individual, someone capable of planning and evading detection. This profile was crucial in narrowing the pool of potential suspects, allowing Alvarez to focus on individuals with both opportunity and motive, elements that had been dispersed and unnoticed in the original investigation. The family connection in DNA. While genealogical DNA analysis had first identified a distant relative, further exploration of the database revealed a closer familial link. Investigators traced connections to a man in his late 70s, whose background and location history placed him in Reno in 1977. Confirming identity. Background checks, employment history, and property records confirmed that this individual had the potential to match the observed behaviors recorded in 1977. Corroborating witness statements. Cross-referencing his known whereabouts with the diner notebook, trailhead observations, and eyewitness accounts strengthened the case that he had been in close proximity to Linda at critical times. Behavioral evidence. Former acquaintances recalled minor, unsettling incidents, instances of inappropriate interest in young women, unexplained absences, and erratic behavior that fit the profile developed by Alvarez's team. The combination of DNA, historical records, and corroborating testimony created a compelling picture. The man under investigation was no longer just a possibility, he was the prime suspect. Re-evaluating old leads. Many suspects from the original 1977 investigation were revisited to eliminate false positives and refine focus. Using modern analytical techniques, Alvarez's team reviewed alibis, cross-checked statements from decades ago against archival records, revealing inconsistencies previously unnoticed. Verified witness credibility, reassessed eyewitness accounts in light of modern psychology of memory and recall, giving weight to some testimonies while discarding others as unreliable. Digitalized archives, converted paper files into searchable digital formats, enabling investigators to spot patterns in names, locations, and events that were invisible to earlier investigators. Through this systematic review, Alvarez's team eliminated dead ends and highlighted genuine leads that had been buried beneath the weight of time. Collaborating with the Hayes family. Throughout the reopened investigation, the Hayes family played an active role. Marjorie Hayes and surviving friends provided personal insight that no document could convey. Memory reconstruction. Marjorie recalled details about Linda's interactions, her habits, and even minor quirks that helped refine the suspect profile. Community connections. The family helped locate witnesses who had moved away or disappeared from official records, providing Alvarez with new avenues to pursue. Emotional support. Their involvement reminded investigators of the human stakes, grounding the case in the reality of loss and the urgency of justice. The collaboration between law enforcement and the family emphasized the personal dimension of cold case work, bridging decades of silence with renewed purpose. Narrowing in on the suspect. By late spring 2023, the pieces began to converge. DNA, archival evidence, eyewitness accounts, and genealogical data painted a consistent portrait of a suspect who had evaded justice for decades. Investigators compiled a dossier with timelines, behavioral analysis, and supporting documents, creating a case robust enough to justify surveillance and eventual apprehension. Patterns of movement. Confirmed locations tied the suspect to key moments in Linda's final days. Behavioral indicators. Subtle tells, such as repeated presence near the diner and trailhead, indicated lingering attachment and familiarity with the crime scene. Historical validation. Archival documents, when reinterpreted in light of modern findings, filled gaps in the timeline and removed previous ambiguities. Alvarez knew the investigation was approaching a critical stage. It was no longer a search for unknowns, it was a methodical closing in on an identified individual, decades after the murder. By mid-2023, decades of silence, uncertainty, and unanswered questions had finally given way to a precise trajectory. The investigation had identified a prime suspect in Linda Hayes' 1977 murder. Detective Maria Alvarez and her cold case task force now faced a delicate but critical stage, closing in on a man who had evaded justice for 4 to 6 years. Every action required precision, and the stakes were both procedural and deeply human. Piecing together the final threads. The task force began by consolidating all elements of the reopened investigation into a cohesive narrative. DNA evidence, genetic material collected from the trailhead and analyzed through modern forensic techniques provided a familial connection to the suspect. Archival records, the diner notebook, previously dismissed by investigators in 1977, revealed repeated observations of the man, including his inquiries into Linda's schedule and his lingering presence in her neighborhood. Eyewitness accounts, re-interviewed neighbors and co-workers corroborated sightings of the suspect near the apartment complex and diner during Linda's final week. Behavioral analysis, psychologists specializing in cold case profiling emphasized patterns of stalking, patience, and evasion consistent with the suspect's historical presence in the area. Each element alone was compelling. Together, they created a web of evidence that could withstand scrutiny in court and justify targeted surveillance. Surveillance and stakeouts. Alvarez's team initiated discreet surveillance to confirm the suspect's current whereabouts and behavior patterns. Though now in his late 70s, the man's daily routines remained predictable: visits to certain properties, interactions with distant relatives, and a tendency to remain close to the routes he had once traveled in 1977. Observation points. The team stationed themselves at multiple vantage points around known addresses and former haunts, monitoring without alerting him. Digital reconnaissance, historical phone records, social media footprints of family members, and publicly available property records allowed investigators to confirm movements without direct confrontation. Behavioral tells, subtle actions, such as glances toward parked vehicles or patterns of avoidance, suggested the suspect was aware of being watched, heightening the tension but also providing validation that surveillance was tracking the right individual. The combination of patient observation and digital research ensured that when the time came to act, investigators would have the highest chance of a clean, legally sound apprehension. Converging evidence from decades-old witnesses. While surveillance continued, the task force revisited key witnesses whose testimonies had proven most consistent. Former co-workers. Employees from the diner recalled details that aligned with the suspect's movements and interactions with Linda, reinforcing the timeline of his presence in the area. Neighborhood residents. Several elderly residents confirmed seeing a man matching the suspect's description on the outskirts of the trailhead, sometimes parked nearby, sometimes wandering close to Linda's apartment. Friends of Linda. Memories of conversations and interactions with the suspect, dismissed as trivial in 1977, now matched the pattern revealed through diner notes, DNA evidence, and genealogical research. By synthesizing these accounts, Alvarez's team solidified the narrative. The suspect had both opportunity and motive, and his movements were consistent with the patterns of a person who had observed Linda extensively before her death. Historical documentation supports modern leads. Key historical documents became indispensable tools in closing in on the suspect. Property records. The suspect had lived within walking distance of Linda's apartment complex during the critical days of March 1977. Employment records. Seasonal work and shifts at a nearby construction site allowed him mobility, proximity, and freedom to engage in behavior unnoticed. Archived letters and notes. Handwritten documents from acquaintances and minor witnesses, previously overlooked, revealed subtle clues about his interest in Linda and his interactions within the community. The corroboration of historical and modern evidence created a compelling legal and investigative framework, leaving little doubt about who the perpetrator could be. The suspect's subtle unraveling. Even as investigators prepared for direct action, the suspect began to reveal subtle signs of stress. Alvarez's team noted minor changes in behavior. Erratic errands, unexpected trips and avoidance of familiar routines hinted at heightened anxiety. Increased observation of police presence. The suspect seemed increasingly aware of nearby law enforcement activity, glancing at parked vehicles or lingering in shadows. Communication patterns. Attempts to contact distant family members became more frequent and cautious, suggesting an awareness that historical actions were now under scrutiny. These tells reinforced the conclusion that investigators were focused on the right individual and that the approach had to be deliberate, cautious, and legally airtight. Coordinating a controlled apprehension. Closing in on a suspect who had evaded detection for decades required meticulous planning. Surveillance confirmation. Multiple days of observed routines ensured accuracy in identifying the suspect's locations and habits. Legal preparations. Search warrants were drafted with precision, referencing historical evidence, DNA matches, and newly corroborated witness statements. Task force coordination. Alvarez's team worked in concert with local and state law enforcement, ensuring backup and a secure approach in case of resistance or unexpected developments. Family considerations. The Hayes family was briefed carefully on the investigative stage, balancing hope with the procedural need for discretion. The operation required patience. Rushing could compromise the entire case, erasing decades of careful accumulation of evidence. The emotional weight of closing in. For the Hayes family, this phase carried a mixture of anticipation, anxiety, and catharsis. Marjorie Hayes, the mother of Linda, long burdened with uncertainty and grief, experienced a fragile optimism. Each new lead brought both hope and fear: hope that justice was finally attainable, fear of confronting the reality of decades-old violence. Community sentiment. Reno, long familiar with the legends surrounding Linda's death, followed developments cautiously. While many remained skeptical that anything substantial could emerge after so long, whispers of renewed investigation reignited collective memory. Detective Alvarez and team. For Alvarez, the stakes were intensely personal in a professional sense. Each detail meticulously verified, each witness carefully re-interviewed, underscored the significance of diligence in cold case resolution. This phase was as much about managing human emotions as it was about compiling evidence, a careful balance of empathy and procedural rigor. Connecting past to present. The strength of the reopened investigation lay in connecting historical evidence to modern methods. DNA integration. Confirmed genetic links tied the suspect to locations and behaviors previously only suggested by anecdotal evidence. Corroborated timelines. Reconstructed sequences of Linda's final days, now informed by witness accounts and archival documents, established a pattern of the suspect's presence. Behavioral validation. Observed stress indicators and avoidance behaviors in the suspect mirrored the patience, stealth, and careful observation expected of the individual who had evaded capture in 1977. By aligning these threads, Alvarez's team had transformed decades of uncertainty into a focused narrative that pointed decisively to one individual. Preparing for confrontation. The final stage before action involved risk assessment and operational planning. Determining the approach, investigators decided that surveillance followed by a daytime, controlled apprehension minimized potential resistance and ensured public safety. Securing legal oversight, judges issued the necessary search and arrest warrants, confirming that evidence, historical and modern, was sufficiently robust. Contingency planning, teams prepared for any eventuality, including the possibility that the suspect might flee or attempt to destroy evidence. Alvarez emphasized that patience remained crucial. Despite the decades-long investigation, the operation had to be executed flawlessly to avoid legal complications. Closing tension. As the investigation reached this climax, the tension was palpable. For investigators, years of dedication were about to bear fruit, or risk collapse if a single detail went wrong. For the Hayes family, the anticipation was both exhilarating and terrifying. Decades of unanswered questions were on the verge of resolution. For the community, Reno's collective memory, steeped in fear and rumor, now held its breath. The man who had haunted local legend for nearly half a century was finally within reach. The culmination of surveillance, evidence analysis, and witness re-examination made one fact abundantly clear. The suspect was no longer an abstract figure in dusty files. He was a real person, identifiable, trackable, and accountable. The day had finally arrived. 4 to 6 years of unanswered questions, decades of grief, and a relentless pursuit of justice had brought Detective Maria Alvarez and her cold case task force to the doorstep of closure. The suspect, now in his late 70s, had been under careful surveillance for weeks, his routines documented, his movements predictable. Alvarez knew that after decades of silence, any misstep could jeopardize both the legal process and the Hayes family's fragile sense of hope. The operation had to be precise, controlled, and devoid of drama. Justice would be served without spectacle. Preparation for the apprehension. The task force convened early in the morning, reviewing every detail. Surveillance logs. Every movement of the suspect had been meticulously documented, from the property he visited to the times he left home. Search and arrest warrants. Judges had issued warrants based on the convergence of DNA evidence, archival documents, and corroborated witness testimony. Operational strategy. Teams were positioned to ensure the suspect could be apprehended safely, without risk to officers or the public. Family coordination. The Hayes family had been briefed in advance, carefully informed that the arrest was imminent but without revealing exact timing, to protect the investigation's integrity. Despite the meticulous planning, Alvarez felt the familiar tension of anticipation, the calm before the storm that often preceded the most pivotal moments of a case. Executing the arrest. The suspect's residence, a modest home in northern Nevada, was approached quietly by uniformed officers and plainclothes investigators. Surveillance had indicated he would be at home in the mid-morning hours, a window carefully chosen to minimize risk. Alvarez and her team moved in. Initial contact. Officers knocked at the door, announcing themselves as law enforcement. The suspect, initially startled, attempted to retreat inside, but the officers calmly but firmly escorted him into custody. Search of the premises. Following proper legal procedures, investigators conducted a thorough search of the residence. They recovered historical documents, photographs, and personal effects linking him to locations and behaviors consistent with the 1977 investigation. Immediate processing. The suspect was transported to the Nevada State Police headquarters for questioning, monitored and documented at every stage to ensure procedural integrity. The arrest, though decades in the making, was executed without violence, the culmination of patient planning and careful observation. Interrogation and confession. Once in a secure interview room, the suspect was confronted with the evidence. DNA evidence. Modern forensic testing definitively linked him to material collected at the trailhead in 1977. Historical documentation. The diner notebook, eyewitness accounts, and archival letters all placed him in proximity to Linda Hayes during her final days. Behavioral consistency. Observed routines, past acquaintances' recollections, and verified timelines were presented to demonstrate a consistent pattern of behavior leading up to the murder. Faced with the weight of irrefutable evidence, the suspect's composure began to crack. Initially defensive, he attempted to minimize involvement, suggesting coincidental presence and vague connections to Linda. Alvarez, experienced in cold case interrogations, allowed him to speak while gently but firmly guiding the conversation toward the truth. Hours into questioning, the suspect finally broke. He admitted to having followed Linda for several days prior to her disappearance. He confessed that an altercation had escalated, resulting in her death along the trailhead where her body had been discovered decades earlier. He acknowledged attempts to cover up the crime, providing details only someone present at the scene could know. The confession, calm yet chilling in its detachment, finally confirmed what the investigation had long suggested. Linda Hayes' murder, unsolved for nearly half a century, had been committed by a man who had managed to evade justice until modern technology, archival diligence, and dogged investigative work caught up with him. Emotional reactions and community impact. News of the arrest spread quickly, both through law enforcement channels and media reports. For the Hayes family, the moment was surreal. Marjorie Hayes, after decades of anguish, the mother finally heard the truth from investigators. Tears, relief, and grief intertwined as she absorbed the knowledge that Linda's killer had been identified and would face justice. Friends and community members, longtime residents, some of whom had whispered theories for decades, experienced a mix of vindication, sorrow, and closure. Many had internalized a version of the crime that now had real resolution. Detective Alvarez and Task Force, the team experienced a quiet triumph. The meticulous work, patience, and combination of modern and historical methods had achieved what seemed impossible: the resolution of a cold case that had haunted the state for nearly 50 years. Yet the emotions were tempered by the weight of history. Alvarez reminded the Hayes family that while justice was now possible, the past could never be undone. The relief of closure coexisted with the lingering pain of decades-long loss. Legal steps following the arrest. Following the confession, the suspect was formally charged with first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. Investigators prepared a comprehensive case file, including DNA reports and genealogical analysis, eyewitness testimonies and re-interview notes, archival documentation, including the diner notebook and historical letters, surveillance and behavioral analysis from the 2023 investigation. Prosecutors emphasized that despite the passage of time, the evidence was sufficient to bring the case to trial. The confession, combined with corroborating evidence, provided a foundation for legal proceedings that would finally hold the suspect accountable. Procedural integrity and historical significance. The Hayes case exemplified the importance of preservation of evidence. Decades-old materials, carefully stored, allowed investigators to leverage modern forensic methods. Persistence in investigation. Cold cases, often relegated to unsolvable, can be reopened with diligence and methodical planning. Combining historical and modern techniques, the integration of archival research, genealogical DNA, witness re-examination, and digital mapping created a comprehensive investigative approach. Alvarez reflected on the broader significance. The arrest was not just a personal victory for the Hayes family but a testament to the potential of cold case resolution to provide justice, even decades later. Reflection. The emotional weight of justice. The arrest and confession did more than identify a perpetrator. they allowed the Hayes family and the community to begin a process of healing. For Marjorie Hayes, the knowledge that Linda's killer had been caught brought a mixture of sorrow, relief, and validation. Sorrow, decades of unresolved grief could not be erased. Memories of Linda's absence, the milestone she would have celebrated, and the life she never had lingered. Relief, the uncertainty and speculation that had shadowed her family for nearly 50 years were finally replaced by truth. Validation, the relentless pursuit of justice, often questioned in small towns and among weary family members, had finally borne fruit. Detective Alvarez, standing quietly outside the police station after the arrest, reflected on the broader implications. Cold cases were never truly cold. With patience, persistence, and evolving technology, justice could eventually prevail. Transition to trial and aftermath. With the suspect in custody and a confession secured, the investigation transitioned to the legal phase: trial preparation, court proceedings, and eventual sentencing. While the arrest marked a monumental achievement, Alvarez knew the work was not complete. Evidence had to be presented meticulously. Witnesses needed preparation for court testimony. The Hayes family required continued support as the legal process unfolded. The arrest and confession, however, were a definitive turning point. Decades of uncertainty now gave way to accountability, and the path toward resolution and closure was clear. The arrest of the suspect in Linda Hayes' 1977 murder was monumental, but for Detective Maria Alvarez and the Hayes family, it was only the beginning of the journey toward justice. After decades of uncertainty, the case now moved to the courtroom, a place where the painstakingly gathered evidence, witness testimonies, and confessions would be formally weighed and scrutinized. Preparing for court. The trial required meticulous preparation from both the prosecution and defense. Prosecution strategy. Led by a veteran cold case prosecutor, the team compiled a case that spanned decades, integrating historical evidence with modern forensic data. DNA results, diner notebook entries, eyewitness re-interviews, and behavioral analyses all formed a cohesive narrative. Every document, photo, and testimony was reviewed for authenticity, relevance, and clarity. Defense challenges. The defense acknowledged the time gap and argued for the possibility of misinterpretation, memory decay, and procedural irregularities. They sought to cast doubt on the reliability of witness recollections from decades ago, despite the confession and DNA evidence. Family support. Marjorie Hayes and surviving friends attended pretrial briefings, guided by victim advocates who explained the courtroom process and potential challenges, helping them prepare emotionally for the trial ahead. For Alvarez, this phase was as much about procedural precision as it was about ensuring that decades of investigative work would stand up to rigorous judicial scrutiny. Opening statements. The trial commenced in the spring of 2024 in a packed Nevada courtroom. Media coverage was extensive, reflecting the national interest in the cold case resolution. Prosecution opening. The prosecutor detailed Linda's life, her disappearance, and the decades-long investigation that led to the arrest. They highlighted the convergence of DNA, archival evidence, and witness testimony, emphasizing that the timeline and behavioral profile aligned with the suspect's actions. Defense opening. The defense sought to frame the decades-long gap as a potential source of doubt, emphasizing the human fallibility of memory and the limitations of historical documentation. They argued for careful consideration of every detail, requesting that the jury weigh the evidence critically. The room, filled with members of the Hayes family, law enforcement, and local community, remained silent. For decades, this case had been discussed in whispers, speculation, and rumor. Now, it unfolded in the open light of the courtroom. Presentation of evidence. The prosecution systematically presented the evidence that had taken decades to compile. DNA evidence. Modern forensic analysis linked the suspect conclusively to material collected at the trailhead. Expert witnesses explained the technology and methodology, demonstrating reliability to the jury. Historical documentation. Diner logs, neighborhood observations, letters, and property records placed the suspect near Linda during the critical days preceding her death. The prosecutor emphasized that these documents, while old, were consistent and corroborated by multiple independent sources. Witness testimony. Re-interviewed neighbors, friends, and co-workers recounted observations, memories, and interactions with the suspect. Each recollection was carefully cross-referenced with documented evidence to reinforce reliability. Confession. Alvarez testified regarding the circumstances of the confession, highlighting the suspect's awareness of the evidence and the voluntary nature of his admission. The confession tied together previously unexplained aspects of the crime, providing a definitive link to the suspect. The evidence was overwhelming in its breadth and depth. For the jury, the integration of decades of investigative work with modern forensic science presented a clear, compelling narrative. Defense arguments and cross-examination. The defense strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt. Questioning witness memory, they emphasized the fallibility of human memory over decades, attempting to discredit certain eyewitness statements. Challenging document relevance. Old records and dialogues were portrayed as circumstantial, not direct evidence of the crime. Highlighting procedural gaps. Any minor irregularities in record-keeping or historical investigative techniques were brought to light in an attempt to question the integrity of the evidence. Cross-examination of Alvarez and other investigators sought to probe the consistency and interpretation of decades-old information. Alvarez remained measured, citing corroborated facts, patterns, and the convergence of evidence that had led to the suspect's identification and arrest. Despite the defense's efforts, the weight of DNA evidence, confession, and corroborated documentation remained unshaken. The jury, having been guided carefully through decades of investigative work, could not ignore the cumulative force of the case. Emotional testimonies. Perhaps the most powerful moments in the trial came from the Hayes family and community members. Marjorie Hayes, she recounted her daughter's hopes, dreams, and everyday quirks, humanizing Linda beyond the case files and evidence. She spoke of the decades-long absence, the unanswered questions, and the weight of grief that had lingered in her life. Her testimony was heartfelt, measured, and deeply moving, leaving the courtroom in a momentary hush. Friends and community members. Several friends described the ripple effects of Linda's disappearance on their lives, marriages, and sense of safety. Their stories highlighted the human cost of unsolved crimes and the emotional toll on those left behind. These testimonies reminded the jury, and the public, that this case was about a real person whose life had been cut tragically short, and a family that had endured unimaginable uncertainty. Verdict and sentencing. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a unanimous verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. Judge's statement. The presiding judge emphasized the historical significance of the case, acknowledging both the passage of time and the perseverance of law enforcement and the Hayes family. He noted that justice, though delayed, was now served. Sentencing. The suspect was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence reflected the severity of the crime, the premeditated nature of the murder, and the enduring impact on the Hayes family and the Reno community. The verdict provided a measure of closure, though it could never restore the decades lost or erase the trauma inflicted by Linda's absence. Community and media reaction. The conclusion of the trial drew widespread attention. Local community, Reno residents, long accustomed to rumors and unresolved speculation, expressed relief and vindication. Community forums and local newspapers reflected on the case's impact, acknowledging the painstaking work that brought resolution. National media. The case became an example of successful cold case resolution, demonstrating the integration of modern forensic technology with historical investigative diligence. Journalists highlighted the persistence of law enforcement and the enduring commitment of the Hayes family. Victim advocacy groups. Organizations specializing in cold cases praised the methodology, emphasizing that decades of unresolved crime could still lead to justice with patience, careful research, and collaboration. The public acknowledgement of the case highlighted both the tragedy of the original crime and the dedication required to finally bring closure. Personal reflections for the Hayes family. For Marjorie Hayes and surviving friends, the aftermath of the trial was both cathartic and painful. Closure. The identification, arrest, conviction, and sentencing of Linda's killer allowed the family to finally name the perpetrator and confront the truth. Grief and healing. While decades of loss could not be undone, the resolution allowed for emotional processing and the beginning of a slow, ongoing healing process. Recognition of effort. The Hayes family acknowledged the tireless work of Alvarez and the Cold Case Task Force, whose persistence bridged decades to deliver justice. The trial underscored the reality that closure, while powerful, is a complex emotional journey rather than a single moment of relief. Legal and historical significance. The trial demonstrated key lessons for cold case investigations. Persistence pays off. Cases long considered unsolvable can be reopened successfully with methodical investigation and modern technology. Integration of evidence. Combining historical documents, eyewitness accounts, and forensic science can create compelling, court-ready cases. Human element matters. Victim and family narratives are essential in contextualizing evidence, humanizing the crime, and conveying the stakes to juries. Justice can be delayed but achievable. While decades of uncertainty challenged both investigators and families, the legal system ultimately recognized the need for accountability. The trial became a blueprint for handling other cold cases, illustrating the potential for resolution even after nearly 50 years. The courtroom lights had dimmed, the gavel had struck, and Linda Hayes' murderer had been sentenced. Yet even as the legal process concluded, the echoes of decades-long grief, community speculation, and investigative persistence lingered. For Detective Maria Alvarez, the Hayes family, and the Reno community, the resolution of this cold case marked more than a moment of justice. It was a prism through which broader truths about crime, memory, and societal responsibility could be observed. Persistence of justice across decades. One of the most striking lessons of the Hayes case was the power of persistence. Nearly 50 years had passed since Linda's disappearance, yet no wall of time could erase the pursuit of truth. Investigator dedication. Alvarez and the Cold Case Task Force exemplified the meticulous patience required in cold case work. Each interview, document review, and forensic re-examination was a deliberate step toward uncovering the truth. Family tenacity. The Hayes family had maintained hope, no matter how fragile, for decades. Letters to authorities, media interviews, and community advocacy kept Linda's case alive, ensuring it would not be relegated to obscurity. Technological evolution. Advances in forensic science, particularly DNA analysis, provided a tangible link between the past and present. What was once considered impossible, the identification of a suspect after nearly half a century, became achievable through innovation, patience, and careful evidence preservation. The Hayes case underscored that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still be achieved when persistence is paired with evolving investigative tools. The human toll of unresolved crime. The emotional impact of Linda's disappearance and the decades-long investigation cannot be overstated. Family grief. Marjorie Hayes had carried the weight of uncertainty for nearly 50 years, experiencing milestones and holidays without closure, and enduring the lingering question of why Linda. Community trauma. For Reno, the case became woven into the fabric of local law. Schools, workplaces, and neighborhoods discussed the disappearance in hushed tones. The uncertainty and fear surrounding the unknown perpetrator created a climate of anxiety that lasted for decades. Investigators' burden. Detectives and officers involved in both the original investigation and the 2023 reopening faced emotional strain. Cold cases demand prolonged attention, balancing hope and frustration while managing the ethical responsibility to victims and families. This toll highlights a fundamental truth: unresolved crimes inflict pain far beyond the immediate victim. They ripple through families, communities, and even generations, leaving scars that only closure can begin to heal. Broader implications for cold case investigations. The Hayes case offers important lessons for law enforcement, policymakers, and communities. Importance of evidence preservation. Historical materials, letters, notes, and physical artifacts proved crucial in corroborating modern forensic findings. Cold cases require rigorous evidence management, even decades after the initial crime. Integration of new technology, DNA analysis, genealogical tools, and digital archives allowed investigators to reconstruct timelines and confirm suspect identities. Cold cases benefit from embracing technological innovation. Community cooperation. Witnesses, neighbors, and acquaintances who were willing to revisit memories contributed significantly to case resolution. Trust and community engagement remain essential in both historical and contemporary investigations. Victim-centered approaches, involving families thoughtfully and sensitively, as Alvarez did with the Hayes family, ensures that investigations maintain ethical and emotional integrity. The case demonstrates that cold cases, while challenging, are not static. With commitment, cross-disciplinary collaboration, and technological advancement, even decades-old crimes can be solved. Societal reflections. Beyond law enforcement, the Linda Hayes case invites reflection on broader societal issues. Memory and history. Collective memory, whether through newspaper archives, folklore, or community recollection, preserves stories that can later aid investigations. The case demonstrates how societal attention, even imperfect or informal, contributes to justice over time. Rural policing challenges. Small communities like Reno in the late 1970s faced limitations in resources, forensic technology, and investigative staffing. The case highlights the systemic barriers that often delay resolution and emphasizes the importance of supporting rural law enforcement infrastructure. Persistent fear and rumor. Urban legends and community myths, which developed around Linda's disappearance, reflect the human need to explain the unknown. While these narratives can distort truth, they also maintain societal awareness of unresolved trauma, keeping cases alive in public consciousness. These reflections illustrate that individual cold cases carry implications beyond legal accountability. They are mirrors of societal response, memory, and resilience. The emotional resonance for families. For Marjorie Hayes and surviving friends, reflection was bittersweet. Acknowledging loss, no legal resolution could restore the life that Linda Hayes had lived, the milestones she would have celebrated, or the experiences she had been denied. The family's grief remained, tempered but not erased by justice. Experiencing closure, knowing the identity of the perpetrator and hearing a confession provided a tangible form of closure. It allowed family members to confront the past directly, rather than exist in an indefinite state of uncertainty. Channeling advocacy. With the case resolved, the Hayes family could now focus on advocacy, awareness, and support for victims' families in similar circumstances, transforming personal tragedy into societal contribution. The emotional resonance of closure is complex. It validates grief, confirms truth, and allows for the first steps toward long-term healing. Detective reflections. For Detective Alvarez, the Hayes case served as a professional and philosophical milestone. Persistence rewarded, years of labor-intensive investigation, cross-referencing old and new data, and navigating bureaucratic and procedural obstacles culminated in justice. The weight of decades. Alvarez reflected on the passage of time, not only the decades of delay in resolution but also the generational impact on the community and the enduring responsibility of law enforcement. Legacy and mentorship. She recognized that the case provided a model for future cold case work, demonstrating the necessity of patience, precision, and collaboration. Alvarez's reflections reinforced a central truth: cold cases are not merely puzzles, they are moral imperatives demanding diligence, empathy, and intellectual rigor. Lessons for future investigations. The resolution of the Linda Hayes case offers actionable guidance for investigators tackling other long-unsolved crimes. Never dismiss historical evidence. Materials considered minor or anecdotal can provide critical connections when viewed with modern methods. Reinvestigate with new eyes. Fresh investigators, unencumbered by the assumptions of the original case, can identify overlooked patterns or inconsistencies. Combine technology and human insight. DNA, digital analysis, and archival research must work hand-in-hand with interviews, behavioral profiling, and community engagement. Center the victim. Always remember that each case is more than evidence. It is a human life, and every investigative choice carries moral and emotional weight. These lessons ensure that the Hayes case continues to influence law enforcement practices, policy decisions, and cold case advocacy. A community healed, yet changed. While Linda Hayes' murder could never be undone, her case ultimately reshaped the Reno community's relationship with justice, memory, and vigilance. Collective closure. Residents, long haunted by the unresolved crime, could finally process the events with the assurance that justice had been served. Awareness and education. Schools, community groups, and media discussions emphasize the importance of vigilance, forensic advancement, and supporting victims' families. Enduring reminders. The trailhead where Linda was discovered and the diner she frequented became quiet memorials, sites of reflection rather than fear. The community's evolution demonstrates how cold cases, when resolved, can transform collective trauma into reflection, learning, and cautious hope. Transition to next case. Even as the Hayes case concluded, Detective Alvarez knew that her work was far from over. Cold cases continue to emerge, often linked through pattern recognition, genealogy, or investigative networks. As the Hayes family began to heal, Alvarez received a subtle reminder of the ongoing nature of justice. Another anonymous tip had arrived, hinting at a case with eerie similarities, a trail connecting different victims, and yet another opportunity to bring closure where it had long been denied. The resolution of Linda Hayes' case, while monumental, served as both an ending and a beginning, a testament to patience, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the enduring impact of justice, no matter how delayed. Detective Maria Alvarez sat at her desk late in the evening, the dim glow of her office lamp illuminating stacks of case files. The Hayes case had finally closed, a rare victory after decades of uncertainty, but her instincts told her that the quiet would not last. The work of justice was never truly done. Her phone buzzed. It was an unmarked number. Alvarez hesitated, instinctively wary. Cold case tips often led nowhere, and false leads had wasted months in the past. Still, something in her gut nudged her to answer. Detective Alvarez? The voice on the line was calm but edged with urgency. I have information about a case, it's similar to one you just closed. You need to see this. The caller remained anonymous, but their knowledge of the Hayes investigation was precise. They referenced details that had never been publicly released: the trailhead, the diner, and even certain behavioral patterns of the suspect. Alvarez's pulse quickened. "Can you meet?" she asked, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Yes. Tonight. Somewhere discreet," the caller replied. Then the line went dead. Alvarez leaned back, considering the possibilities. Was this another decades-old cold case, one that had slipped through the cracks like so many others? Or was it a current investigation disguised by anonymity? Either way, the implications were clear: her work was far from over. The pattern emerges. As she reviewed old Hayes case files one last time, Alvarez noticed something she hadn't fully appreciated during the trial: subtle parallels that extended beyond Linda's murder. Behavioral tells, unexplained movements in certain towns, and a trail of unsolved disappearances in northern Nevada. The Hayes case, though closed, might have been part of a larger puzzle. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Other victims. Could there be more women whose disappearances had been quietly attributed to accidents or voluntary absences? Similar MO, the methodical nature of the Hayes murder, the specific locations, and the way the perpetrator had eluded justice all hinted at a calculated pattern. Anonymous tip: whoever called tonight had knowledge of both historical facts and law enforcement procedures, suggesting a deep connection to the crimes, or to someone covering them up. Alvarez pulled a map of northern Nevada, marking the trailhead where Linda had been found, alongside other unsolved cases from the 1970s and 1980s. Lines began to form in her mind, connecting dots that had never been linked officially. The potential scope was chilling. A mysterious figure. Later that night, Alvarez met the caller at a quiet, deserted parking lot near the outskirts of Reno. The air was thick with tension and desert chill. A figure stepped out of the shadows, tall, hooded, and cautious. They handed Alvarez a manila envelope, no words exchanged. Inside were documents, photographs, and handwritten notes. Old police reports, files from unsolved cases, some decades old, bearing striking similarities to the Hayes case. Photographs of locations, trailheads, diners, and small motels where victims had last been seen, each annotated with cryptic symbols and observations. Handwritten patterns. The anonymous tipster had noticed patterns across time, geography, and victim profiles, suggesting a deliberate and calculating hand behind multiple unresolved crimes. Alvarez's heart raced. The Hayes case, monumental as it was, could have been just one piece of a much larger network of crimes that had evaded justice for decades. The shadow of danger. As Alvarez drove home, the weight of the information pressed heavily upon her. She knew the risks. Exposing long-hidden crimes, revealing decades-old secrets could endanger witnesses, suspects, and even her own investigation. Potential for violence. If the perpetrator, or someone protecting them, was still alive, any misstep could be dangerous. Time sensitivity. Every day without action could allow evidence to degrade further or allow conspirators to cover their tracks.